And I wanted to, before I throw it open, I wanted to put to you really some of the points that Eva Lisa raised in her talk about elements that are trans-historical, insofar as quite a number of these revival movements were presented in the 20th century as outside history, that somehow the spirit of the style or its relevance was still as meaningful in the 1920s, 30s or 1970s as it might have been in the 16th, 17th and 18th century. Now, I don't see myself in history, although I accept the part that I should be. I should see it that way. And therefore, that proposal could be seen as absurd. And yet many people believe that there is something in the style of a period which gives it a trans-historical, or almost a trans-chronological quality that means that it's no longer part of history. I wonder if I could ask you to develop this, in that many of these styles are revalidated because they are not historical, that they are above history. Would anyone like to take this up?
One interesting book that I didn't mention, which was hugely important in kind of recasting style as something more fluid, something that is maybe, certainly maybe not outside history, but certainly outside maybe kind of dates, if you wish, is Henry Fosillon, the Life of Forms, which talks extensively about style in this manner, that it's actually not defined by periods, but that styles, when we look at style, we are talking about a much longer process that can spill over, Gideon was obviously a reader, into this sort of eon of time. That some traces, some nuclei, some genes, migrate through time. That it's not just like, kind of, again, I think it comes from evolution. It's not like, we are all, of course, related. We all have little genes that we share. It's not like we can, draw the boundaries between. So it was in this type of mode that they started to think about style, that you can't put a beginning and an end date to a stylistic period, but it's rather kind of a stage in the evolution that it's much more longer, And like I said, in the case of Baroque, argument was that it was, it went from the primitive to the future. It was eon, So I think Fosillon was really kind of perhaps the most interesting writer to reframe a style beyond the notion of a period style. Yeah. So that's very, they are period style, but this notion of style is very different.
Then, I don't mean to bandy historians and theorists around, but this is completely opposite to Wolflin's view of style, who said that not all things are possible at all times, and so it's absurd to be using the Rococo or the Baroque in the 1930s, just as it was impossible to use the Baroque in the 1250s.
Yeah.
And in other words, style is historically specific.
Yeah. So like, let's say Fosillon exactly, he said that there's this form, and so this assumed that form can be explained through external factors, let's say economy or culture, kind of social history. Fosillon argued that form is free. It has nothing to do with history, or maybe some things. Of course, sometimes it enables some things to come to the surface, but that there's this sort of form can be only explained through forms. It's a formalist dance, Wolflin is still that there's this correlation between kind of social history, cultural history, and form and style. So this is beyond, this kind of travel, moves beyond that. Yeah. Self-linear. And of course, he was interested in kind of what you were talking about, like how to explain how forms migrate from Scandinavia to Tokyo or back, that it can't be only explained through external factors, that something else is going on when we talk about how forms migrate, across even the territory that we covered today. So I think that kind of set the challenge to the Wolflinian argument.
I was thinking also of something that David has written in the past on this about, there was quite a widespread view in the early 20th century that style of the peasantry was beyond history.
Yeah.
That the peasantry were not in history.
Yeah.
That they were somehow independent. History was a middle and upper class activity.
Yeah.
And therefore the peasant styles were ever present. So I don't know if that relates in any way to this concept.
It's interesting as you frame that, you need to say in the late 19th century. So there's always the challenge of historicising where that particular consideration or understanding comes from. So as we were talking just a moment ago, I was trying to think about who is writing these enormous, expansive accounts of time and style. It makes me think about Gibbon or somebody like that. It's somehow easier to be doing that work if you're in Berlin or you're in London, or you have this sort of possibility to have a claim on an encyclopedic vision. And I don't know whether that would also hold true for other parts of the world at the same time. So it seems to me one way of historicising this is to see this. It's kind of art history as a form of imperialism in its own right.
I quite agree, and I have to say that I think that to talk of the timelessness of the peasant in a 20th century early 20th century Japanese context is profoundly linked to Japanese nationalism and to the effort to establish a sovereign modern nation in a context of predatory imperialism, in which Japan was itself seeking to become and became successfully an imperial power. But so I find it a little difficult to think about, timeless universal forms without finding that discourse in fact collapses back into national ideology, which of course is also about timelessness and about a sort of constant development. I don't know if that makes sense really, but I do think there's something.
It's totally interesting because actually this guy Fosilion, he also was very interested in what they call popular arts, he wrote a book, an exhibition about that. And I think his political mindset was this, kind of post-First World War desire for some sort of pan-European, post-national state, and of course, they were very interested in how different, kind of like regal, how different formal motives are shared across time and across cultures, So this celebration of the popular arts was really kind of in tandem with also kind of a universalist, humanist project, that again has its historical context in the interwar period in Europe.
Could I raise a separate question here, which was raised very early, but which you didn't come back to, was the role of museums in revivalist styles, and indeed of governments in promoting this. But certainly museums which present themselves as recorders of the past, as somehow impartial collectors of key materials, they recur constantly in this discourse around the fact that they are shaping the visual culture and the stylistic repertoire of nationalism. I was thinking in the early stages, certainly the role of museums in actually providing the raw material for the Gustavian style. This is not an indifferent activity, and it actually plays into a nationalist mode that the government itself is directing. And is that true everywhere or no?
Well, I suppose you definitely see the same processes in Hungary. One of the things that really interests me is the problematic status of home industries and folk art, which initially, in Hungary at least, are collected in the decorative arts collection. And that how you compartmentalize or deal with the relationships, distinctions between those kinds of products, which Regal was talking about. I think that's really, really interesting. And then the ethnographers they're not really super happy to take on the home industries when the collections get transferred.
Well, in Italy, you experience something interesting in the sense when you compare what happens with temporary exhibition and permanent museums. So in temporary exhibitions, especially up until the 1936-37, there is this strong original, somehow also modernist approach, and then the same exhibition, when the display becomes permanent, it changes completely. So, for example, the 1932 Mostra della Rivoluzione Fascista, which of which the design was very modernist, almost constructivist, when it becomes a permanent museum, assumes all the elements of traditional canonical exhibition, museum exhibition, and then it becomes the model of the Mostra Augustea della Romanità. So it's again that tension that I was talking about between the permanent and the temporary. The temporary is the space of experimentation, but then the permanent is still the idea of Rome that either in a Baroque style or in a neoclassical style, but it's always the archetype that is important, which is Rome.
I would also add that in the case of New York in particular, it's interesting that a curator who I mentioned by the name of Herbert Spindon, he leaves AMNH and goes on to the Brooklyn Museum, and his specialty is really the Maya world. And he takes on this really a considerable project at Brooklyn, which is that he wants to begin to collect vernacular folk art from Mexico as a continuation of the Mayan legacy, whether there's visual or exact connection is not really the case. It's just the point of this is a legacy that continues on, and he links it into this sort of grand narrative around indigeneity and also the Americas. And he does regional dress. I mean, he does everything that you could possibly imagine. And then, of course, that's also linked to things like tourism and travel, and going to these areas, knowing that these people are technically still alive, and you can see them in their modern form. And so in New York, and I would say in the States, museums very much hold a really important place in understanding ideas around revivalism and these cultures and nationalism. And in Mexico, if anyone has ever been to Mexico City and the Anthropology Museum, it's sort of this very powerful nationalist tool that is focused on pre-contact cultures. And it's now that they're starting to think about how this narrative can continue, and that's with contemporary designers who are working with indigenous or traditional craftspeople to create these modern designs that are interesting for the public to consume, but also continues this rhetoric around nationalism and tradition and sort of keeping it alive. And it's kind of become very much a trend to say, well, I'm a contemporary designer and I went to this town and I worked with these craftspeople and this is my product. And sometimes they work together and sometimes they don't. But how they push that forward to project this idea of national unity, this idea of culture, history, an evolving culture too, is quite interesting.
Sorry, Henry, yeah, you want
I picked up on several threads here that's been discussed, I think. But one thing that I find interesting is that we need to reflect on our own way of writing history now and the way we describe style. I've been looking into the Gustavian style for how we described it for 100 years, and I would say it's never outside history. It's always part of, and it's a changing story. And looking into our way of relating to that, to acknowledge these changes also as historians and not accept that it should be one continuous meaning of a style, the use of style.
No, I think one thing that also was interesting in this talks that several of the talks, I think at least 3, dealt with style in different ways. I mean, we can also talk about lifestyle. Germans have this wonderful word called Denkstil, the way of thinking. So in a way, the style implies also these sort of other modalities, that refer to something that again is quite difficult to pinpoint down. But that I think, so when we talk about style, we are not only talking about period styles, but I think the idea of lifestyle is also very relevant to the discussion.
Style has been a very unfashionable topic for a long time. And 10 years ago, I could never have imagined myself holding a symposium on revivalism. But it does arise out of a sense of two creeping doubts in my mind about design and architectural history, that they are not a discipline. They are just social history with objects or things.
Is that bad?
Yeah. And on the other side, that the early masters of architecture and design history were not naive when they said that style was the key to understanding historical change. This is bringing back to the view that the dismissal of style in the 1960s, 70s and 80s, when I was a student, was a rather youthful rejection of an orthodoxy. But Wolflin and Riegel weren't stupid. And nor is the way that they are understood nowadays the full story. I suppose that was why I've come back round to this, and why indeed I'm starting to think that style might be the way back in to some deeper questions of meaning. But I'll leave it at that. That's my mea culpa. Perhaps I should throw this open now to others. Yes,
I just
please
wanted to
do.
make a comment that there was a lot of conversation about nationalism, but I think there was also a tremendous sense of nostalgia for a past that was rapidly changing, both because of World War I and all of the movements of all the cultures that were being merged or disappeared, and new countries were being formed out of other countries or what was areas, and that there was also the push of industrialization, so that you have all of a sudden small communities and small towns that have been pushed into the new 20th century with all of the changes of industrialization. I think there was some comfort for both reasons, both because of war and industrialization. There was comfort to look back at and have revivals. So, did anyone want to make a comment on that?
That would be the logic of the aesthetics of the Third Reich, though, wouldn't it?
Actually, the opposite. I think that I think they used that. I think they used it, but they used and manipulated that. But I think that people were confronted. All of a sudden there are cars in a small town. All of a sudden you've been making crafts, whether it's in Japan or you've been making crafts in Europe somewhere, and you're in a small town, and all of these things are your culture. So how do you adapt that to a new world? Well, now you saw what happened, the baskets that happened in the 1950s, that all of a sudden you have a shopping basket out of your traditional crafts. So I think that it was also an adaptation to who are we, who each culture found itself looking for. How do they take the past and bring it into that new world?
I guess I at the same time feel as though there's a sort of logic of destruction at work as well, that the revival or the appreciation of the folk and the primitive is related in some way to an imperative to destroy it, which I think is part of,
What do you mean by an imperative to destroy it? It was war that destroyed. I mean, war came and destroyed towns and villages and cities and cultures. Buildings fell.
Well, I think that, modernization and industrialization and urbanization have a very destructive logic.
Yeah.
And I feel that there's a way in which the celebration and the commercialization and the reproduction of some of these forms is related to that process of destruction.
No, and even, I live in and work in this neo-Gothic environment, Dirties. First I came, I was like, what's wrong with America, So it's kind of interesting how these buildings came into being, because it was, of course, also a reaction to social change. I mean, Yale was, institutions in a way did this. So this idea that there's something like this whole new cohort of people who are not, from the right families. So it was kind of this sort of, control of, governance of, training to, the architects talk about this, that we kind of try to indoctrinate these people in a certain manner, and you have reading rooms and you sit by a fireplace like a gentleman and so on. It's kind of like, it's almost so literal that it's so pathetic, but this was really and there's also one thing that they were also very worried, and his group writes about this, they were very concerned about commercial architecture in this country, that what was happening, that there were this kind of economic forces that were creating kind of virulent modernism, this sort of commercial modernism, and that somehow real architecture is about architecture, that it refers to the past, that without history, that without teaching history to architects, architecture architecture would resort into this sort of commercial mess. And we can kind of relate to that when we go to a box, big
Strip
box,
mall.
the strip mall, that there's so there was a kind of, you're absolutely right, that there was I mean, whether you call it nostalgia or what, but it was certainly a reaction to this sort of feeling of that the change is somehow out of control and partly undesirable, So, but it is really bizarre, this neo-Gothic. It's quite good also. It's humanistically quite good.
It raises quite an interesting question about why do we teach history to architects? What is the function of history
What is
to
the
architects?
function of history?
Because once they're in the hands of developers, architects are not really needed in terms of knowing much history. But what I think teaching history does is it provides a whole set of models and paradigms for understanding social relationships between people, to understand perhaps bigger questions about the use of resources and things like that. So that I think in some ways teaching history is part of the modernist project, which is the ethical project of architecture. So there's a kind of paradox, that we teach history to be more ethical, to serve that modernist project well. And if we don't do that, then we end up with architecture that's in the hands of developers and time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think that the teaching of stylistic history is, I was thinking about your remarks about Baroque. I did an exhibition on Rococo as an organic some style that kept on going to the present day, looking at contemporary Dutch design right up to the present. But the idea of what people mean and whether Hitchcock and all were horrified by the term Rococo, in the sense of really expressing what you were showing with the finished lakes and the Alto. The Alto Savoy vase was in my exhibition as an example of the Rococo spirit in another era. But my question is, for comment, is do you think that the word Baroque meant something different in a sense to Hitchcock? I mean, we think of it now in a much more classical way because we accept the Rococo paradigm, but whether Rococo was an unusable word.
Yeah, well, the point I wanted to make that they, said, okay, this is not a historical style. It kind of comes to your point about ethics.
Right.
That it's not about the style.
No.
It's a kind of form. So it's about the ethic,
Right, and I'm saying the breakaway aspect of the asymmetrical, the organic, is much more breakaway than Baroque itself. So the question is, what did they really mean when they used the term for the idea?
So, it's interesting actually, this sort of idea that, the historicist mode was like you copy president, you're truthful, you understand the ornamentation, all that. So the modern way that citing these styles had much more to do with this, what do we call it, ethical or something that translates to whether it was feeling in the sense of the neo-Gothic, that it's not about that doesn't matter, the form doesn't matter really, it's what it delivers, that it delivers a certain type of feeling. Same with the Baroque, that it was, again, in that case, it was more like, when we are Baroque, we love the world. It's universal, embracing. It's interesting, the history lessons that they teach, it's not about copying the style, it's not really understanding the style or the historical context, it's really about this sort of mentality.
I guess what I'm trying to say is it about the mentality. Is do you think the modern person, or at least those who even try to understand these terms, thinks of Baroque as a spirit in a more staid way in 2018 than they did in 1929. And because I don't think it means the same spirit now. And the same way that I've been forbidden by our Cabrera's education department from using the word patronizing, that somebody patronized a firm, because too many people today consider that a negative word. And so I'm just saying, these perceptions of word meaning.
No, that's interesting, but I don't know whether they've been so, diluted or transformed, like there's this wonderful wonderful historian that I did not mention today that belongs to a group called Karl Schäfer. You know, he writes about Pelzig.
Right.
Pelzig, he said, there's Gothic in him. You know, there's Gothic in him. So for a German reader audience at that time, they would have understood what it means to have Gothic in him or her. So you would say, Aalto has Baroque in him. Do you have Baroque in you? I don't know if these terms don't make, but at this time, these would be kind of triggers, that people would know what they mean. I don't think they have that meaning anymore,
That's what I mean. So in teaching about the spirit, one has to teach about the meaning of the stylistic spirit. At the time the person was saying it. So it's just as much about the history of the period than in the way that the same other aspects are.
No, I don't think, it's interesting, I don't know what the students now really, I don't know what they, I just delivered a talk in London actually about, because it's very interesting how they always look at the Instagram, and they always have something on the screen. It's like their reference point are just, they are going all over the place. They are not, they travel through time so quickly. It's not in order. It's certainly not a trim tree. What they're looking at. It's like a galaxy of things that they are at the same time. And I don't know if we can group them into any categories anymore. I don't know. What do you think?
It's really interesting, isn't it, to be in a time and space where everything is available to you
all
always.
the time.
And that's a very different understanding of the world where hitherto it had been organised sequentially and cause and effect had been put in place.
Correct,
I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking about Deleuze and about the rhizome, right?
Yes,
this is a kind of rhizomatic understanding.
Rhizomatic understanding. So it kind of a little bit begins there, but it's kind of beautiful. I'm not too concerned, but it's interesting because I think I don't know how they navigate and make the choices. If there's no kind of ethics attached to images anymore, because at this point there was clearly there was a kind of a sense that the form correlated with something. Maybe not with the historical moment, but with the feeling at least. But now it's just
maybe the feeling now is everything. So the form is everything. Right?
Yeah.
Just back on the topic of teaching history, which I find really fascinating, but also just when we're talking about just media and access to these things and whether our perceptions of style evolve or whether they're calcified by virtue of the time periods when we studied that particular thing. I think that in terms of architectural history, there's the impulse towards the global, which is this kind of synchronic approach where you kind of map similar developments that are going on, across geographies. But there was something in the last two presentations that kind of make me think about other ways other ways to maybe not contradict or not contest, but augment this kind of image culture that seems to be saturating. I teach studio, and it's really impossible to get students away from their phones, and it causes I feel like as a studio instructor I'm like plagiarism police. It's there's a lot of design plagiarism in studio because of it. But the thing is, almost we have to I wonder it's this retreat to the text, to the textuality of these things in order to detect these feelings. It's this more concerted effort, and that brings me to two comments that were made and the two observations that were made in the last two presentations. One was the idea of just or in the commentary, it's how can we think of writings that kind of these large-hearted writings that have this imprimatur to kind of save civilization while we're pressing it at the same time. We're talking about space-time and architecture being written during the Second World War, and it's always my approach is to start thinking about that book, how it was written around the same time as Erich Auerbach's Mimesis or Panofsky's book on Albrecht Dürer, and then years later there's George Kubler's book. So the idea, it's the text becomes the very mechanism, the the very mechanism by which these things are almost like the seed that becomes the rhizomatic plant, the thing that allows things to, the very thing that allows the new tradition to grow is not the style, but maybe it's the text, So I don't know if that means that we have to like go back to teaching better writing of history or whatnot, but.
No, I'm fascinated with these texts and also the text that you just mentioned, because they really try to, they really try to model all these sort of sets of influences and how they transverse, and you can almost see like the pattern they form. So absolutely, I think they are wonderful and for me very helpful in terms of also trying to navigate the present. I think, for example, the Shape of Time, Kubler's Shape of Time is a very potent book for today. Think about what's going on today in the ether of internet and so on.
I think we should let the speakers relax a bit and have a drink, and maybe round this up by saying it in the spirit of the Baroque being universalist. We will be open to new suggestions and new ideas. I never thought for a moment we were going to come to any conclusions today, and I'm still not sure whether the next few years of my life are going to be devoted to revivalism, or indeed I'm going to retreat back to my modernist rejection of revivals as a curse on civilization. But I feel as if I know a bit more about it today from the talks that I've heard and the ideas that these have generated in my mind. So I'd like to bring today to a close with a round of applause for our speakers.